everyone. My name is Lenora Henson. I'm the interim deputy director, curator, and director of public programming here at the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site. They keep adding things to my title anyway. On behalf of our board of trustees and our staff, I'd like to welcome all of you to the final speaker night in our 2018 series. I can't believe the series is almost over for this year, but welcome. And I'd especially like to welcome Laura Cinturati, who is our guest speaker this evening. For those of you who don't know, Speaker Night is our opportunity on the fourth Tuesday of most months to invite experts to come in and help us think not only about some of the issues that were important during TR's presidency, but also more broadly about TR's life and legacy. The TR Site Speaker Night series is made possible by the generous support of M&T Bank, as well as the New York State Council on the Arts, NYSCA. Our sincere thanks to both groups. I should mention that NYSCA's support has enabled us to record all of our speakers, not only this year, but also last year. So if you've missed any of our speaker nights, I hope you'll check out the recordings on our YouTube channel. As I already mentioned, we are joined this evening by Laura Cinturati, who is a museum technician with the National Park Service at Sagamore Hill National Historic Site. A fellow Long Island native, she grew up in the town next to Theodore Roosevelt's home at Sagamore Hill. Laura holds a bachelor's degree in history from Wellesley College and a master's degree in museum studies from Johns Hopkins University. She's worked in the curatorial department at Sagamore Hill for 4 years, taking care of the Theodore Roosevelt home and collection. Her talk this evening, Divided Between Pride and Anxiety, the Roosevelt Family and the Great War, is especially timely as the centennial of Armistice Day approaches. Laura developed this talk in conjunction with an exhibit at Sagamore Hill commemorating the 100th anniversary of the death of TR's youngest son, Quentin Roosevelt. I'm delighted to turn the podium over to Laura. Please join me in welcoming her.
Lenora, for that wonderful welcome, and thanks everyone for welcoming me to the inaugural site. This is the first time that I've been here, and I've absolutely loved my experience. I've learned a lot here, so thank you for allowing me to come up here and visit with everyone. So as Lenora said, I have the really awesome job of being a museum technician at Sagamore Hill National Historic Site. If you haven't been, I really encourage you to go. Theodore Roosevelt's home on Long Island, where he raised his 6 children, beautiful 83 acres, and I really feel like you get a better sense of who TR was when you see his home and you see the land that he loved so much. So the presentation that I'm going to be giving this evening, Divided Between Pride and Anxiety, the Roosevelt Family During the Great War, I took that line, Divided Between Pride and Anxiety, from a letter that I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation. But it's a letter from TR to his son Archie, right after the family finds out that Archie has been wounded during World War I. So those are TR's actual words that he writes to his son. We're going to be discussing the family's contributions to World War I, but we're going to also start with TR's views on World War I and kind of what his background was when it came to the idea of war. This talk is also going to especially emphasize Quentin Roosevelt. We did have an exhibit this summer about Quentin Roosevelt because it was the 100th anniversary of his death this past July. So there'll be special emphasis on Quentin, who holds a close place to my heart. Some of this background information might be rather familiar to you, especially if you've been to other talks at the site, if you volunteer at the site, if you work at the site. So please excuse me if I go into just a little bit of background information about the family. So I just like to start with a little bit of family background because I think it really helps to put some faces and names together. So Theodore and Edith raised 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls, between Washington, D.C., Albany, and Sagamore Hill. And they were raised according to the values of the strenuous life. They were taught to work hard, to study hard, to participate in rigorous physical activity. And TR and Edith really wanted to raise their children to become productive citizens that would really contribute to the United States in the future. As children of the president, the American public really followed the children quite closely, and the press wanted to follow their every move. TR and the American public really expected great things for the Roosevelt children in the future, and people thought that TR's sons would truly follow in his footsteps. TR had entered politics as an assemblyman for New York State, but he really catapulted to fame following the Spanish-American War in 1898. His highly publicized actions in Cuba made him a household name and launched him on a higher political career path. Shortly after he returned to Long Island, the press and New Yorkers called for him to be nominated for governor of New York State. He won the election, paving the way for his nomination to the vice presidency under President William McKinley and the succession to the presidency after McKinley's assassination. TR's actions in the Spanish-American War had truly brought honor to the Roosevelt family name. They had also brought honor to the country, and TR hoped that his sons would have the same opportunity to serve their country in the future. So going through a very famous photo of the family outside of the North Room at Sagamore Hill, you see Ethel standing on the left, Ted Jr. behind his father, Alice in the center. On the right you have little baby Quentin sitting on Edith's lap, and then you have Archie and Kermit. TR had a rather complicated relationship with the military. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., had not actively fought in the Civil War. Instead, he had done what most upper-class, wealthy New York men had done, and he hired a substitute, but for a little bit of a different reason. His wife, Martha Bullock, was from Roswell, Georgia, and had several family members fighting on the side of the Confederacy. She feared that her husband and her Southern family would meet on the battlefield and kill each other. Although TR never mentioned embarrassment about his father not fighting in the Civil War, some historians have speculated about the effects that the experience had on TR as a young child, and how it impacted his views on service to the country. Though TR's favorite president was Lincoln, growing up TR was very interested in the war stories of his Confederate uncles and cousins. TR did not have a regular formal military career, as we might imagine today given his accomplishments. He did not attend a military academy. He did not formally train as an officer. His military experience really initially consisted of listening to those war stories from his Confederate family members, reading about war, and writing about war. He wrote his first book on the Naval War of 1812 as a Harvard student. Later, he would go on to hold the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and that's the position he resigned from in order to form the U.S. First Volunteers to fight in the Spanish-American War. TR really looked back on the Spanish-American War years with fondness and pride. He romanticized war. In fact, his favorite title was Colonel for the rest of his life. Prior to the famous charge of San Juan Hill, which was really Kettle Hill, but that is another story, TR wrote to his friend Henry Cabot Lodge saying, "Should the worst come to the worst, I am quite content to go now and to leave my children at least an honorable name." Friends and family accused TR of exhibiting reckless behavior and rushing to get involved in the Spanish-American War and during the war itself. He had fully prepared to die in Cuba because honor to your family and country was really paramount to him. Yet TR was critical of the regular army and regular army training. He wrote to his son Archie in 1917 saying, "In '98, I was better than any colonel, save on the regulars before Santiago. In the Army, it is only the exceptional men who can conquer the unfavorable conditions. Few Army regulars go on improving after they become majors, and as soon as a man ceases to improve, he goes backward." Similar to TR's view in 1898 that the U.S. should declare war against Spain quickly, TR was adamant that the United States should have joined World War I earlier. He criticized the sitting president, Woodrow Wilson, for not entering into the war sooner, telling his son Kermit, "Wilson is at heart an abject coward, or else he has a heart so cold and selfish that he is entirely willing to sacrifice the honor and interest of the country to his own political advancement. We ought to have universal military service." TR was surprised, and he was gravely disappointed that the U.S. did not enter the war following the German sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. When TR learned of the sinking, he had said to the press, It seems inconceivable that we can refrain from taking action in this matter, for we owe it not only to humanity, but to our own national self-respect. TR would have to wait nearly 2 years for the US to join the Great War. And I love this illustration here. This is a political cartoon that came out prior to the 1916 presidential election. It shows TR sitting on top of Sagamore Hill, and he has his arms outstretched almost like an airplane. And the propellers, one of them says, "Down with peace," and the other one says, "Hurrah for war." And then the main part of the airplane is TR's big stick. Theodore Roosevelt was a proponent of preparedness, universal military training, and universal military service. TR and military leaders of the time, like Colonel Leonard Wood, did not think the U.S. was sufficiently prepared for war. They advocated forming formal military training programs for college-educated and college-bound young men, as well as young businessmen in the form of ROTC and summer military camps. A military camp was formed in Plattsburgh, New York, in 1915 to help train volunteer citizens to become soldiers. Several other military camps popped up across the United States to prepare the male population in case of U.S. entry into the war. TR's sons, Ted Jr., who would have been 28, Archie, who was 21 at the time, and Quentin, who was 17 years old at the time, would attend the first session of the Plattsburgh camp over the summer of 1915, and they would return again in 1916. TR's other son, Kermit, who was 26 at the time, was working in South America, so he did not attend the camps in 1915 and 1916, but he would later go on to attend the camp in 1917, preparing for his military career. At the camp, the boys learned about modern warfare. They gained valuable leadership skills that could potentially give them higher ranks when they did join the fight overseas. TR visited the camp in August 1915 at Plattsburgh, and after his visit, he wrote to Kermit, calling the camp a glimmer of hope. The people who attended represented the best of our class and our race, according to Roosevelt. And some of these photographs show his sons, specifically Archie and Quentin, and Archie and Ted Jr. at Plattsburgh, and then TR visiting Plattsburgh with Colonel Leonard Wood in September of 1915. Almost immediately after the U.S. declared war in April of 1917, TR traveled to Washington, D.C. to petition President Wilson to allow him to raise a band of volunteers, similar to the Rough Riders in 1898. Warfare and technology had greatly changed, however, in the 19 years since the Spanish-American War, and Wilson and his military leaders did not think TR was fit enough physically or well-versed enough in the new war methods to be successful, and they declined his offer to raise the volunteer cavalry. TR was deeply upset that he would not be going overseas to fight. He wrote to his friend John Burroughs saying, "I shall never cease bitterly regretting that I was not allowed to go to the other side. I would not have expected to come home alive." Does that sound familiar to something TR said during the Spanish-American War? I hope it does. If TR was not going to be able to fight, though, he could at least help try to secure good commissions for his sons. And so he wrote to General Pershing to ask that Ted Jr. and Archie be able to enlist under his command as privates, though he mentioned that when they had attended Plattsburgh, they had attained the ranks of major and captain, respectively, in the Officers' Reserve Corps. And Pershing eventually agreed, and Ted Jr. and Archie received their orders to travel overseas to Europe to join the American Expeditionary Forces, not as privates, but as major and a first lieutenant. Kermit, who had missed out on a lot of that military training because he was in South America, wished to get to the front as quickly as possible. He wanted to either fight with the British or the Canadians because he thought it would really bring him to the front faster, and he could bypass some of the training. TR wrote to his friends in Great Britain to see if he could secure Kermit a good commission with the British forces. To his friend Cecil Spring Rice, TR wrote, "It is of course asking a favor, but the favor is that the boy shall have the chance to serve, and if necessary be killed in serving." TR and Edith's youngest son, Quentin, took leave from his studies at Harvard to enlist, and TR was able to use his influence to get Quentin into flight training for the U.S. Air Service in Mineola, which is only about a 20-minute drive away from Sagamore Hill. Archie wrote to his brother Quentin's fiancée Flora in 1917 saying, You are drifting into a family that is doing what is right, as well as it knows how, and you will never ever have to make any excuses for any of your future in-laws not sacrificing themselves for the cause. Prior to departing for the front, Quentin Roosevelt had told the president of Allegheny College, Reverend William H. Crawford, "It is rather up to us to practice what Father preaches." And I was really struck by these two images when I was doing my research for this presentation. These come from popular magazines and newspapers, Leslie's Weekly and the Chicago Sunday Tribune. So it does show that Americans want to know what has happened to the Roosevelt children, even though they're not in the spotlight of the White House anymore. It even goes into the other side of the Roosevelt family, showing FDR at the bottom and what he's up to during World War I. And the piece on the right is a juxtaposition. It shows the Kaiser's sons on the top, dressed in their finest military officer uniforms, their formal dress. They were given positions that did not involve them being at the front. And it juxtaposes them with TR's sons, a former president's sons, who are not wearing their military finest. They're wearing their rough and tumble uniforms. They're out at the front serving in very dangerous positions. And this comes out actually after Quentin Roosevelt's death, which is why Quentin is in the center. But before getting on to the activities of each of the Roosevelt children during the war, I just want to highlight the home front a little bit. TR and Edith sent 4 sons, 1 son-in-law, 1 daughter, 1 daughter-in-law, overseas for the Great War. And back at home, Edith wore a 5-star pin, as did her daughter Ethel. And these are 2 of the pins that are still in our collection today. The 5 stars may sound confusing because 4 Roosevelt sons, but the 5th star was for Ethel's husband, Dr. Richard Derby. And so Edith proudly wore that extra 5th star to honor her son-in-law, as did her daughter Ethel. The family flew a 4-star flag at Sagamore Hill, which you can see in the photograph here on the left. And this is taken in the library at Sagamore Hill, with the very iconic zebra skin rug on the bottom. I know I said it's a 4-star flag. You can only see 3 stars here. And that's because little Richard Derby Jr. is holding the flag folded. And the part that you can't see is the star that has been recently turned to gold, the star on top, which represents Quentin following his death. During the war, Edith and TR had an important role in that they cared for their grandchildren and supported their daughters-in-law while their husbands were away. Their daughter Ethel and their daughter-in-law Eleanor both left their children in the hands of TR and Edith when they went overseas with their husbands. Describing her feelings about her sons being overseas, Edith wrote to a friend saying, "It is like becoming blind or deaf. One just lives on, only in a different way." In July of 1917, TR wrote to Quentin, "It is dreadful to have you all go, and it would have been far worse to have you not go. My veins thrill with pride when I think of you." A month later, he further explained his feelings to Quentin about all of his sons being at the front. "My disappointment at not going myself was down at the bottom, chiefly reluctance to see you 4, in whom my heart was wrapped, exposed to danger while I stayed at home and doing nothing in ease and safety. But the feeling has now been completely swallowed in my immense pride in all of you." At this point, I want to talk about Alice. I know she's probably everyone's favorite Roosevelt child, and I was really surprised when I was doing research about her during World War I, because I was expecting a big story, and I never really got my big story. But to just go over her accomplishments during the war, looking back, she did do her part to contribute to the war effort. She encouraged people to buy war bonds, she staffed a few canteens, she worked with the Red Cross, and she writes about that in her autobiography, but very briefly, and she talks about it in a way as if everyone was doing it, and so I did it too. Her real role, though, was being almost a political hostess, a political ambassador in Washington, D.C. While her husband, Nicholas Longworth, was serving in Congress, he did not go overseas. And so they were responsible really for hosting people in Washington, D.C. who were figuring out how the war was going to be paid for, what to say about the war to the American public. And she also helped host her father several times when he was down in Washington, D.C. But moving on to the rest of the family. What I was surprised to find was Ethel was actually the first person in the Roosevelt family to go overseas to support the war effort. Ethel and her husband, Dr. Richard Derby, were the first Roosevelts to go overseas in 1914, supporting the war effort, almost 3 years before the U.S. formally entered the war. Richard Derby worked as a surgeon at the American Hospital in Paris, while Ethel was a nurse for about 3 months. When the pair returned to the States, Ethel became heavily involved in the Red Cross, and it really drove her kind of life mission, her life passion for the rest of her life. She also participated in library drives to help send books overseas to soldiers, maybe realizing that her brothers needed something coming from home, needed some extra morale boost. After the U.S. joined the war, Richard Derby would return to the front in France, working as a surgeon in the 2nd Division. And if anyone finds a photograph of Ethel in her World War I uniform, please let me know, because it was so challenging to find a photograph of her wearing the uniform. She proudly wears her World War II nurse's uniform a lot. There's a great painting of her wearing that, but we have not been able to find a World War I photograph of Ethel in uniform. So if you find one, please call me. But the photograph on the right at least shows her during World War I pinning a pin onto her husband, Dr. Richard Derby. Ted Jr. was truly interested in a career in the military long before the war, but his father has discouraged it because he did not think that regular Army training was that beneficial to his career, and he had wanted Ted to go into politics. But Ted was insistent that he wanted to serve during the war, and so he was assigned to the 1st Division, 26th Infantry in France. He suffered at least 2 major injuries during the war. At the Battle of Cantigny, he was gassed by the Germans, and the citation from his commanding general read, "On the day of our attack in Cantigny, although gassed in the lungs and gassed in the eyes to blindness, Major Roosevelt refused to be removed and retained the command of his battalion under a heavy bombardment throughout the engagement." And I really think that when TR read those words, I think it really brought him back to 1898 and brought him back to his time during the military. We're fortunate to have a couple of Ted Jr.'s uniform pieces in our collection at Sagamore Hill, including his 1st Division patch and his 26th Infantry pins. For our opening of our exhibit about Quentin Roosevelt, we had borrowed mannequins and pulled out a couple of the different military uniforms, but unfortunately we found that Ted Jr.'s shoulders are very, very narrow, and his jacket would not fit on any mannequin that we tried. So I think it's kind of funny to look at him in this photo and you see kind of a strapping young man, but he had very narrow shoulders apparently. In July of 1917, Eleanor Butler Roosevelt, the wife of Theodore Roosevelt Jr., sailed for Europe to work for the YMCA in France. TR had not wanted her to go. He had seen the toll that the war had taken on Ethel when she had been overseas 3 years earlier, and he did not think that the women in the Roosevelt family should follow their husbands overseas. He changed his mind, however, and Eleanor managed to get overseas before the U.S. imposed a restriction on travel for relatives of soldiers and sailors. Travel across the Atlantic Ocean was very tricky during this time, remember, because of the German submarine warfare. And U.S. lawmakers also feared that if wives, sisters, and daughters were to go overseas, they would distract the soldiers ultimately. Eleanor had luckily spent time in France as a child, and she did have connections with her family there, allowing her to be able to set up this home base that would become the Roosevelt home base in Europe throughout the war. She began her work for the YMCA, which included managing the canteen and teaching French to soldiers. She offered the Roosevelt boys food, care, comfort, and company during difficult times, and Richard Derby reflected later in his book, "I shall never forget several days with my sister-in-law. She always took splendid care of anyone who turned up at her house." Before he entered the war, Kermit had written to TR, "I don't like the war at all because of Belle and Kim," Kim was his new son, "but as long as it's going on, I want to be the first in it." Kermit first served as a captain with the British Royal Engineers in Mesopotamia who were fighting the Ottoman Empire. He received the British War Cross for his actions. By May 1918, he was transferred to the American Expeditionary Forces as a captain of the 7th Field Artillery of the 1st Division. Archie was assigned to the 1st Division, 16th Infantry in France, but later transferred to the 26th Infantry, the same regiment his brother Ted was in. TR did not support having the two brothers fighting in the same regiment, but the brothers stuck together. Like all of the Roosevelt boys, Archie was remembered for his willingness to be first at the front. Fellow soldier Paul Michaels referred to Archie as an absolutely selfless gladiator who insisted on being the first to smell the enemy's bad breath, regardless of the risk. Looking back, historians have pointed to a sense of recklessness in all of the Roosevelt boys during the war. Archie confessed to Quentin's fiancée Flora in a letter in 1918, "With so many of our family over here, I confess that I never take up the paper without a tremor." In March of 1918, Archie was seriously wounded in battle. He had taken shrapnel in his kneecap and broken his left arm. We actually have the shrapnel in our collection at Sagamore Hill, so there's 3 pieces that are on the right. After it was confirmed that he would live, the family rejoiced at his gallantry at Sagamore Hill. TR wrote to Archie, "Of course tonight we are divided between pride and anxiety. Beloved fellow, early this morning the newspaper men told us you had been given the Croix de Guerre. Well, we know what it feels like to have a hero in the family. You don't know how proud we are of you. Mother ordered some Madeira, all 4 of us filled the glasses and drank them off to you. Then Mother, her eyes shining, her cheeks flushed, as pretty as a picture and as spirited as any heroine of romance, dashed her glass on the floor, shivering it into pieces, saying, 'That glass shall never be drunk out of again.' And the rest of us followed suit and broke our glasses too." After spending time at a hospital in Paris, Archie was ordered back stateside to recover. He was discharged from the army with full disability and received both Silver Stars and the French Croix de Guerre. The youngest son of TR and Edith, Quentin began flight training in April 1917 with the U.S. Air Service at the Hempstead Plains Aerodrome, which had been recently renamed Hazelhurst Field. It had previously been a National Guard base, and because the base was so close to Sagamore Hill, Quentin could be mostly a commuter student. Sometimes Quentin would even get the chance to fly over the home of his sweetheart, Flora Payne Whitney, in Old Westbury. The two had become engaged that spring, but the engagement was kept quiet because initially each family disapproved of the match. I'm not really going to go into what happens with Quentin and Flora, but I saw that the book Quentin and Flora is downstairs in the gift shop. Definitely recommend that you purchase it because it really is a fascinating story to look into, how their 2 lives kind of ran parallel for a little bit and then went their separate ways. Quentin trained at Mineola for about 3 months in a class of 50 college-educated young men. A Canadian lieutenant colonel who went to Hazelhurst for an inspection described it as backwards and lacking organization. He estimated that the training facility was functioning about 4 years behind the Canadians. The flight school at Mineola lacked the proper number of military training pilots, and many of their planes were in old and poor condition. But it's here that Quentin first learned to fly, on the Curtiss Jenny JN-4 biplane. Later in France, however, he had to learn how to fly something new, and that was the Nieuport plane. Regarding the Nieuports, Quentin wrote, "These little fast machines are delightful. You feel so at home in them, for there is just room in the cockpit for you and your controls, and not an inch more. And then they're so quick to act. You could do 2 loops in a Nieuport in the time it takes a Curtiss to do 1. In early July, Quentin achieved the rank of first lieutenant in the aviation section of the Army Signal Officers Reserve Corps. Shortly after, he received orders to go to the New American Flight School in Issoudun, France. He spent about 10 months in total at Issoudun, working as a supply officer and a transportation officer, while still training to fly and training others to fly. At one point, Quentin received orders to go to the front, but a misunderstanding kept him at Issoudun. Quentin feared being called an embusqué, someone who shirks his duties, and he received very negative letters from his brothers Ted Jr. and Archie, who were already at the front. Quentin wrote to his father in December 1917, "I'm not overpleased with my status at present. I know both Ted and Arch feel that I am the embusqué member of the family, and the trouble is, they're right. The only thing is that I am certainly not responsible for it. I'm going ahead with my advanced flying down here as fast as I can, and trying by every means possible to get up in a French or British squadron. What Arch and Ted don't see is that I really have done everything in my powers to get out. I don't stay behind the lines by choice, and I'm not hunting for a non-flying occupation. TR, sensing the mental stress that his youngest son Quentin was feeling at the expense of his older brothers, wrote him in February of 1918, saying, I am exceedingly indignant at Ted and Archie. I am more proud of you and satisfied with you than I can say. On June 8, 1918, Quentin would get his chance to move out to the front, joining the 95th Aero Squadron. TR was completely overjoyed with the news and cabled to Quentin, a couple of days ago, we were thrilled by your cable. I know how hard the long delay has been. My joy for you and my pride in you drown my anxiety. You are at the front and I am satisfied. The family had further reason to celebrate on July 10, 1918, when Quentin downed a German plane. The New York Times published a celebratory article about Quentin's kill, and the family celebrated at Sagamore Hill. TR wrote to Kermit, the last of the lion's brood has been blooded. He also wrote to Ethel, whatever now befalls Quentin, he has now had his crowded hour and his day of honor and triumph. If you think about TR, his own crowded hour had been when he was serving in 1898. He's proud that his sons are having their crowded hours during World War I. This amazing photograph is actually taken by Quentin Roosevelt in France, showing the different planes that are flying. The family's joy would quickly turn to despair, however. Just 4 days later, Quentin was shot down by the Germans behind enemy lines while on raid on July 14, 1918, which happened to be Bastille Day. Since his plane fell behind enemy lines, there was initially no confirmation of what happened to Quentin. At first, Quentin's friends thought that he might be missing or maybe captured. But after searching the wreckage of an American plane, the Germans realized that the pilot was Quentin Roosevelt, the son of former President Theodore Roosevelt. Having respect for Theodore Roosevelt and Quentin's bravery, they gave him a military burial with honors. The Germans took this photo of Quentin, bloodied next to his plane, some say as propaganda. The photograph was printed as a postcard and was distributed among both sides during the war. Multiple copies of the postcard ended up making their way to Sagamore Hill and are still in the collection today. And I've seen two different versions of this. This is definitely a staged moment in time. Quentin would not have been next to his plane like that. But it does show that in the heat of the moment, someone thought to photograph this. The other version I've seen of this photograph actually shows a white sheet over Quentin's face. When we were putting together our exhibit, we debated about including this photograph at all, because it's very disturbing, especially if you know the story of Quentin, you know the story of the family. But we decided that it was important to include because it was something that the family did see, and having so many of these in our collection, it does mean a lot to the family. We decided to show this one and not the one with the white sheet over his face. We found that that was even more disturbing in a way, not to be able to see his face. Several days after Quentin's death, American forces regained the territory and they discovered Quentin's grave. They took parts of Quentin's plane and they formed it into the shape of a cross. The grave would take on several different appearances over the years, growing more permanent and formal with time. It should be noted, however, that Quentin, his grave was actually moved following World War II, and he was moved to the American Cemetery in Normandy, where he still is today alongside his brother, Ted Jr. The family first received news that something had gone wrong with a family member overseas on the 16th of July. A telegram had been sent to the New York Sun from a reporter who was at the front in Europe. The telegram advised to watch Sagamore Hill 4, but the end was cut off. TR realized it had to do with one of the boys, either being injured or being dead. The next day, another telegram arrived with a local reporter who carried the unofficial news of Quentin being shot down over enemy lines. Though they did not exactly know what Quentin's fate was, TR made a public statement to the reporters regarding Quentin. Quentin's mother and I are very glad that he got to the front and had a chance to render some service to his country and show the stuff that was in him before his fate befell him. After the news was confirmed, condolence mail flooded into Sagamore Hill. Theodore and Edith decided to seek solace at Ethel and Richard Durden's home in Dark Harbor in Islesboro, Maine. The mail was forwarded to the family there, including heartbreaking letters from Quentin before his fall because of the delay in mail. Though the family had prepared for death during the war, Quentin's death deeply shook the family, which was still dispersed throughout the United States and Europe. Ted Jr. wrote to Ethel, "Quentin's death is always going to be the greatest thing in any of our lives." After Quentin's death, the artist McCutcheon drew this cartoon for TR, showing TR changing the fourth star on the flag from blue to gold. Reflecting on the death of Quentin, TR wrote to a friend and fellow Rough Rider Bob Ferguson, "It is bitter that the young should die, but there are things worse than death. For nothing under heaven would I have had my sons act otherwise than as they acted. They have done pretty well, haven't they? Quentin killed, dying as a war hawk should, over enemy lines. Archie crippled and given the French War Cross for gallantry. Ted gassed once and cited for conspicuous gallantry. Kermit with the British Military Cross, and now under Pershing." The nation mourned Quentin's death, though. The boy they had followed through the press from his antics in the White House gang to his victory overseas was dead. A newspaper article from 1918 asserted that Quentin's death had changed Quentin from being TR and Edith's son to the nation's son. Long Islanders also mourned the loss of Quentin, and on September 24, 1918, the Army dedicated the eastern portion of Hazelhurst Field No. 1 as Roosevelt Field. Most people today don't know that Roosevelt Field is actually named after Quentin Roosevelt and not TR. After Quentin's death, TR tried to continue on with life as usual. He traveled the U.S. on a speaking tour to encourage people to buy war bonds, and he continued his writing for the Kansas City Star. When the war ended in November, TR had to be checked into the Roosevelt Hospital to be treated for rheumatism and several other lingering ailments from his trip to Brazil in 1913 and 1914. He was released from the hospital just in time to celebrate one more Christmas at Sagamore Hill. On the morning of January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt died of a pulmonary embolism at the age of 60. Archie cabled, "The old lion is dead," to his brothers Ted Jr. and Kermit, who were still overseas. Some historians say that perhaps TR also died of a broken heart due to Quentin's death. Losing his youngest son, the son that was most like him and perhaps had the brightest future of the four, in a war that TR had pushed for, had placed enormous stress on him and his health. Throughout the Great War, Theodore Roosevelt was divided between pride for his children, serving their country, and his anxiety that they would be harmed or worse, killed. TR's anxieties came to fruition with the death of the youngest son, Quentin. His wife Edith observed to Kermit, "Quentin's death shook him greatly. I can see how constantly he thinks of him, and not the merry, happy, silly recollections, which I have, but sad thoughts of what Quentin would have accounted for in the future. The war that TR had adamantly fought to join took away his precious son, who was destined for a bright future." It's hard to find the right conclusion for this. But even though her role in the war was a little bit more downplayed than what I was expecting, I really think that Alice Roosevelt captured the sentiments of her family accurately. Later she wrote in her autobiography, "All our lives before and after have just been bookends for the heroic, tragic volume of the Great War." Thank you. So this last photograph actually shows TR on one of the speaking tours following Quentin's death. And if you notice, he has a black armband on his left kind of suit jacket sleeve. It's something that I don't think we necessarily think of today, like a president grieving for his personal family by wearing something like this in public. But Quentin's brothers did the same. I just saw a photograph recently of Ted Jr. in a military parade in Oyster Bay the year following his brother's death, and he's also wearing a black armband around his left sleeve. Does anyone have any questions about World War I and TR and the Roosevelts and the children, or questions about Sagamore Hill for that matter?
Where is Sagamore Hill on the island? I don't know.
Yeah, so Long Island is a fish. I wish I had a picture of a fish right now. But closest to the city, you have Brooklyn and Queens, which are on Long Island, but someone from Brooklyn or Queens will never say that they're from Long Island. But then the next county over you have is Nassau, and it's like kind of a small strip almost close to the middle of the island. And Oyster Bay is on the north shore of Nassau County, so close to the center of the island, a little bit farther west towards the city. And then Suffolk County is the county that extends all the way out to the North Fork and the South Fork. So that location was perfect for TR when he was serving as police commissioner, especially in New York City, because the railroad was out in Oyster Bay at that point, so he could live there with his family and travel back and forth. The reason why he had purchased property out there to begin with is because his family used to go out there when he was a boy. They rented a small house called Tranquility in Oyster Bay. And when he married Alice Hathaway Lee, they ended up purchasing property very close after the wedding. They went on their honeymoon to Tranquility, and they ended up purchasing the property that would later become Sagamore Hill. So he really fell in love with the area as a child, very different from the area where he grew up in New York City. Great question. Yes?
So, how did you get the name Sagamore?
Yeah, great question. So Sagamore, originally they were going to name the home Lee Home after Alice Hathaway Lee, TR's first wife. But when Alice passes away, TR is so devastated that he can't bear the thought to call anything Alice, even his little daughter. He never really talks about Alice to little Alice. So he figures that he needs to rename the home, and they come up with the name Sagamore Hill because there was a Native American chief, Sagamore Mohannis, that ruled that area, owned that area of Long Island where Sagamore Hill was. And so they come up with the name Sagamore, which essentially means chief in the local Algonquin language. You're welcome. And it's really Bammy that encourages him that he still needs to build the house. They had purchased the land, they had built a stable and lodge, but they hadn't started building the home yet prior to Alice's death. And when Alice passes away, Bammy is the one who looks after little baby Alice, and she convinces TR, you still need to build a home because now you have a family to think of. So she actually oversees the construction. Any other questions? Yeah.
This is the first account I've heard of this part of his life, and I know that he was a man of his time. He seems to have a romantic idea about war, right? And I think modern fathers would not have this view about that. And if someone were to say, Teddy Roosevelt got what he wanted out of this war, what would you say?
That's a great question. A great comment. I think when I was doing the research for the exhibit and this talk, I hadn't read a lot of these personal letters between him and his children, and I hadn't read some of those letters between TR and his close friends. And it's very difficult to figure out exactly what TR was thinking because he really changes attitude based on who he's talking to. So to his war friends, the friends that he was in the Rough Riders with, he celebrates the boys' service in the war, he celebrates Quentin's death. But to his cousin Edith Wharton, he talks about how he can barely bring up Quentin's name because it's so upsetting to him. So I think it's hard to figure out what was really going on in his brain because when you look at the primary resources, you see two different sides, and I really think that whoever he was writing to, he kind of tailored his words to that. So I think in a way that he did kind of get what he wanted in the end. He wanted the boys to serve. He did not get what he wanted in that he didn't get to serve himself. I think that's an important thing to factor in when thinking about how he felt about his boys overseas. He expected to serve overseas and not come back. So it's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer for you because it's so hard to tell what his true thoughts were because they seem so different from person to person. And it's a question that I wish I could ask him. If he was here today, I wonder what he would say to you and to all of us about that question. Yes?
Well, I don't think that they would want to send a former American president over to fighting a war, especially one that was as horrific as World War I was.
Mhm.
And maybe a lot of the his change of heart was the reports that came back from the war and how, you know, the gas attacks and the bombardments were so horrific, and so many lives were lost by the French and the British, and you know, and then when the U.S. got involved, you know, I mean, that probably had a lot to do with it, I would imagine, no?
Yeah, I mean, it was a completely different war than the war that he had fought in 1898. It was longer, it was more brutal, the technology was different, the chemical warfare was different, and he did not know at the beginning of the war that things were going to be like that on the ground. I mean, I'm sure he read newspaper accounts of the war, I'm sure he saw the footage that was coming back, but maybe really also talking to Ethel, who was on the ground in 1914 towards the beginning, that could have also changed how
Describing
he
the
felt about
hospital
the war.
scenes.
Excuse me?
Describing the hospital scene.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Describing the hospital scenes and, you know, what she's seeing as a nurse. She's seeing very different injuries than he would have seen among his own men in 1898. So it's definitely a different experience. It's a different world for him. It is kind of shocking to think, though, that he thought Wilson was going to let him go, especially his relationship with Wilson. But then the idea that he's, you know, in his late 50s, he's not in good health, he has to be sent to weight loss camp a couple of times in the years prior to
Well,
this.
just the simple information that he has about the country. I mean,
Yeah.
if he was captured by the Germans, right? I mean, that's something
I mean,
you won't imagine.
he thought that he could ride in with his volunteer cavalry like he had in 1898. I don't know if he really understood to the highest level that there was going to be no match for that over in Europe at the time. Yeah.
You helped us to understand that he was a real self-taught soldier, that he, you know, brought himself forward and his leadership skills emerged. And it seems like sort of cognitive dissonance that his sons, he wanted them not to go to West Point where they would formally learn what they needed to learn as soldiers, but this like pretend camp in Plattsburgh. So I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, when the sons were being raised, they were of an age where they remembered, except for Quentin really, they remembered their father training himself to go down to Cuba. There's a really great scene that I think maybe Edward Renahan talks about in Lion's Pride. He talks about the kids being excited that their father's going off to war, and you know, they follow him to the rifle pit at Sagamore Hill and they watch him taking shooting practice. They're very excited, they're very wrapped up in the idea, our father's going to war, our father's going to war. I think it's that feeling of excitement and wanting to be part of something, but not wanting to do the regular thing, not wanting to go to your West Point, not wanting to go to a military academy. And I don't think TR would have supported any of them going. I think he thought it would be a waste of time for them because he did not think that their occupation was going to be centered around the military. He wanted all of them to really essentially go into politics, make a name for themselves, trying to improve the country, following in his footsteps. That I think at one point Ted Jr. maybe did think about going to a military academy, and he was talked out of it. The kids also had so much pressure placed on them from a young age. At one point, Ted Jr. has a nervous breakdown because so much pressure is coming from being Theodore Roosevelt's namesake, being the first son of Theodore Roosevelt, and the responsibility that comes with. That I don't know how they would have done in military school either. I'm not sure how things would have been different had Ted Jr. been allowed to go to one of those schools. It's a good question, but TR just did not think that the regular military route was for his sons, but following kind of the military preparedness route made more sense. At that point, there was more of an urgency that the U.S. is at some point going to get involved in the war, and he wants his sons to be players. He wants them to be on that main stage, representing the family, representing the country, so he knows that they have to get some type of training. So those preparedness camps, especially being run by Leonard Wood, a good friend of the colonel, I think he had confidence that they were going to get the training that they needed there to do well overseas when they did join the war. Yeah.
You talked about Pershing and how he reached out to him for these things. Was there any correspondence you received or that we know of where that individual brings back to him while this is up?
When Quentin, yeah, there is a letter that Pershing writes to TR following Quentin's death. I think it's interesting, initially Pershing doesn't immediately respond to the request for Ted Jr. and Archie to be under his command. And I think some people may have thought it was a conflict of interest because he had been friends with TR. But it is interesting to see later how he does send a letter, a very personal letter to TR after Quentin's death. And those are the letters, the letter from him and then the letter from Wilson, or the telegram from Wilson. Those are fascinating to read because so many different types of condolence mail comes into Sagamore Hill. So reading the different tones of each letter and then knowing kind of like the personal relationship that TR had with the person who sent that letter, it definitely makes for some interesting reading and some compelling context for what TR and what his family and friends are feeling during that time. I think if you search on Theodore Roosevelt Center, that letter might be available from Pershing, but if not, I can find a copy online. Thank you.